Welcome, everyone. We'll just give it one more minute for folks to join the webinar, and then we'll get started. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Steve Ross, and I'm a senior fellow at Stimson, leading a project here on the crisis in Rakhine State, and I'll be moderating today's discussion exploring the key political, economic, and security implications of Myanmar's civil war for India-Myanmar relations, as well as changes in India's foreign policy towards Myanmar. I can think of no one better to provide insights on these issues than Angshuman Choudhury. Angshuman is a joint doctoral candidate in comparative Asian studies at the National University of Singapore and King's College London. He is from the Northeast Indian state of Assam. Before coming to NUS, he worked as an associate fellow at the Center for Policy Research in New Delhi, and prior to that, as a senior researcher and coordinator of the Southeast Asia Research Program at the Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies, also in New Delhi. He has a Master's of Science in Conflict Prevention and Peacebuilding from the School of Government and International Affairs at Durham University, UK. He completed his Bachelor of Arts in History from Ramjas College, University of Delhi. In 2019, Angshuman was a GIBSA visiting fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin. We'll do a moderated discussion, and then we'll open it up to audience question and answer. And I invite members of the audience to include their questions in the Zoom chat. To get started, Angshuman, can you briefly walk us through the evolution of India's policy towards Myanmar from the Look East policy in the 1990s to the Act East policy in the 2010s, and now its approach in the post-coup period?
Thanks, Steve, and thanks to Stimson for asking me to talk about this. It's really an interesting time to talk about India-Myanmar relations because a lot has been happening in the last. Lot has happened in the last 1 month, in fact. I mean, it's always an interesting time to talk about Myanmar, given what's happening there. But before I answer your question, I would like to say that the genesis of sort of India's relationship with Myanmar and the core thinking behind India's relationship with Myanmar actually goes back beyond the Look East policy, which came up in 1991. So if you don't mind, I'm going to share a short timeline just to give you a visual glimpse of what the trajectory of India's relationship with Myanmar looks like, and let me know if you can see it. Is this visible? Okay. So as I said, 1991 was when India created something called the Look East policy. The idea was to build a stronger relationship with Southeast Asia, with Myanmar as the key pivot to Southeast Asia. But, the relationship started sort of the core ideology behind the relationship, the core philosophy behind the relationship began or took birth in the decades prior to 1991. And there's really, I mean, I just want to focus on 2 or 3 crossover points or crossover years when things changed significantly to bring about a shift in the philosophy behind the foreign policy. One was 1962, which was when Ne Win took over Myanmar through a coup, and through a very violent and brutal coup. Before that, India had a very good relationship, with a very warm relationship with Myanmar. India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, had a very warm personal relationship with his counterpart, Burmese counterpart, UNU. In fact, Myanmar was probably the only kind of friendly country which India assisted militarily after the independence in 1947 and 1948 to defeat the communist uprising, the communist insurgency, and also the ethnic insurgencies. But 1962 was when this very, very ultra-nationalist, Burma nationalist figure takes over, right? And with whom India is extremely uncomfortable with. So what happens from there on is the relationship becomes frostier. But what's important to understand, and probably not talked about as much, is the fact that even during this period of a frosty bilateral relationship between Delhi and the Nevin regime, or BSPP, the strategic relationship continued very much. And it is in these decades that the core idea of working with a regime that India is not probably ideologically comfortable with, but needs to work with from a strategic point of view, that thinking basically emerged. It's precisely in these decades. So, as you see in this photo, Indira Gandhi, the daughter of Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, also hosted Nevin in Delhi. And in fact, Nevin came for 2 trips, and she hosted him very, very with fair degree of warmth. So there was an understanding that there needs to be a pragmatic element in the foreign policy, and there was one key element of the pragmatic policy, which was China. India did not want Myanmar under Nevin to grow close to China, which is why Indira Gandhi hosted Nevin, despite being uncomfortable with his ultranationalism, and particularly his anti-Indian ultranationalism, in which he expelled so many Burmese Indians, or Indian origin Burmese, from Myanmar. But what happened in 1998 or 1988 was also significant, which was when the 888, the 4/8 uprising took place in Myanmar. And Rajiv Gandhi, who was Indira Gandhi's son, who was then prime minister, did something extraordinary, which is he opened the doors for political exiles and refugees from Myanmar, opened camps, and gave very, very active and visible and explicit support to the pro-democracy movement in Myanmar. And in a recent book, Avinash Paliwal, who used to teach at SWAS, he actually makes an interesting argument. He says that this was actually an aberration. Rajiv Gandhi government's welcoming of these refugees and pro-democracy support to the pro-democracy regime was an aberration from the norm, and the norm was working with the junta. So what we saw after 1991 was not actually completely new. It already happened, but it seemed new because just 2 or 3 years ago, India was supporting the pro-democracy movement in Myanmar. But as I said, 1991 was really a crossover point, right? So, which is when, you could say the shift from idealism, what some scholars have called the shift from idealism to pragmatism, started. And in the next few decades, we saw, India develop this kind of idea of working with the military regime to secure its strategic and economic interests. So you see this raft of bilateral economic agreements being signed, and Thanchwe being welcomed in Delhi. As you can see, then Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and President APJ Abdul Kalam welcoming Thanchwe in Delhi. So this is when basically the relationship that we see with the modern day version of this relationship emerged, right? And this is when this idea of working with whoever is in power in the Burmese capital for the sake of an interest-driven foreign policy really came into being. And I also want to mention that when the Saffron Revolution happened in 2007, India's response was very, very muted. Even at the UN, India abstained from resolutions condemning the 2007, the brutal crackdown on the Saffron Revolution. So you see this kind of neutrality emerge in India's foreign policy, right? And sorry, I think it went back for some reason. Okay. Yes, but what's even more important to understand is what happened in the the previous decade, the last decade, right before the coup. When in 2014, Prime Minister Narendra Modi comes to power and he upgrades Luki's policy to actist policy. I would personally argue that it was more or less just renaming without any real big policy shift. But the idea was to really build very strong, durable linkages, relationships with the economies of Southeast Asia, and particularly using Northeast India and Myanmar as what the government used to call the land bridge to Southeast Asia, particularly Myanmar as a land bridge to Southeast Asia. So there was serious attention to Myanmar starting 2014. And in fact, Prime Minister Modi formally inaugurated the actist policy in Naypyidaw on the sidelines of the BIMSTEC summit in 2014. So, we see this very, very close strategic cooperation and political alignment. But what we also see is growing defense relationship, a growing military to military relationship. In 2017, India signed this massive torpedo deal in which India supplied, I think, 35 million US dollars worth of torpedoes to Myanmar. Min Aung Hlaing, who is now the junta chief, visited India in a very long visit. It was an 8-day visit. 2 years later, he visited again on an even longer visit. And in 2014, of course, Modi visited Myanmar for the first time. And right 1 month after the Rohingya genocide began in August 2017. And we see this kind of statement coming out from Delhi, particularly joint statement coming out from Delhi, which completely supported the Aung San Suu Kyi government's position on the Rohingya issue. And of course, in 2020, India gifted the submarine to Myanmar, and 1 year later, the Chinese gifted another submarine. So we see this kind of very fierce geopolitical competition around Myanmar developing at the time. But what's interesting to see now is how the relationship has panned out after the coup. And in my view, at least this is my reading of it, and there could be various readings of it. In my reading, there are 3 key phases in the post-coup phase. The first phase was, as you can see, from the start of the coup until April 2022, which was when India was a little more circumspect about engaging with the junta, because there was a lot of global attention on the coup. There was a lot of there was snowballing, huge avalanche of condemnation of the brutal crackdown on the protesters. So I think India was in a wait and watch mode and wanted to see what happens until the dust settles. But April 2022, a new ambassador takes charge, and that's when the normalization phase begins. And India kind of goes back to its institutional memory of working with the military and restarting, kind of rebooting its relationship with the military. So this foreign secretary visit in 2022 really brought out the attempt to normalize relationships, right? Relationship with the junta, in which we saw this very, very short statement, only focusing on economic and strategic issues. Unlike the December 2021 visit, when India also mentioned things like cessation of violence, return to democracy, etc. In the November 2022 statement, none of that was mentioned. So India kind of dialed down on mentioning democracy, talking about democracy, or pressuring the junta to restore democracy. But I think the third crossover point, which is when the phase 3 comes in, and I would say phase 3 is what the phase that we see currently is after Operation 1027 in October 2023, when you could see the political geography of Western Myanmar kind of started shifting. And India realized that it needs to, kind of slightly tweak its policy, that the SAC, the junta, might not be in control of everything, or it might not be what India or Myanmar might not be what India thought it would look like after 2 years. So after that, we see this kind of under the radar subnational engagement with anti-junta EAOs. And this particular picture really brings that out, right? In February 2024, a Mizo MP from the upper house visited southern Chin state in Paletwa township and met some officers of the Arakan army. By that time, the Arakan army had already taken over most of Paletwa, which is in southern Chin state, right across the Indian border. And this was, this picture is extraordinary for the simple reason that this is a upper house parliamentarian from India who's crossing the border and meeting an EAO. We don't get to see these kind of pictures from India very often. So this really showed that things are shifting a little bit, but I would say let's not read too much into it. What we also see is this kind of flurry of engagement between India and the top leadership of the SAC in the last few months, especially in the last 1 month. Which is what we are seeing right now. So broadly speaking, the baseline here is that India continues to very much formally engage with the SAC right now because it's used to working with the military in Myanmar, but it's also started engaging very silently with the anti-junta EAOs, or the ethnic armed organizations.
Thanks very much, Angshuman, for that very helpful historical overview up to the present. I think it'd be particularly interesting to dig into the dual track approach a bit more, and just a reminder to our audience to put your questions in the Q&A box in Zoom. But on this dual track approach, with regard to India's relations with the SAC, as you alluded to, they continue to pay some lip service to democratic norms. But there is still a very heavy focus on India's relationship with the SAC, and Just in the last week, there's been a series of meetings and engagements. A delegation from India's Naval War College visiting Myanmar, India's ambassador meeting the SAC foreign minister and social welfare minister, as well as the chair of the military-aligned Union Solidarity and Development Party. What can you tell us about what Delhi expects from its relationship with the SAC, and what might it be hoping for through its support of the elections planned for next year?
Yeah, I think as I said, one of the core philosophies behind, we basically see this core philosophy that germinated in the 90s coming up once again, which is that India has no other choice but to work with whoever is in power in nepotism. So that is a core philosophy, and that in India's view very much happens to be, of course, the SSC at the moment. And that kind of, if you extrapolate that philosophy, it also amounts to something like considering the SSC as the only legitimate government of Myanmar at the moment. And we've got to understand that Delhi has a habit of working with unionized or centralized powers. So that's what we're seeing right now, that here's this kind of central power who's in control of probably not the entire country, but at least the Bamar dry zone, Bamar heartland. And if India wants to secure its economic and political and strategic interests, it has no other option but to work with SSC. So India expects SSC to deliver certain political returns in terms of continuing to recognize India as a formidable regional power, especially as a power that can effectively countervail China's presence in Myanmar. That's a political front. Secondly, India also expects SSC to deliver on some of the economic and developmental partnerships, which I feel is completely counterintuitive, because I don't think the SSC is in any capacity to do that. Many of the Indian projects are in areas which the SSC are not even in control of. But there's this notion, at least notionally, India expects SSC to keep the veneer of economic engagement propped up. That includes, for example, recently India and the SSC signed a trade localization or currency localization agreement in which they agreed to do trade in their local currencies, in Indian rupees and kyat, rather than in dollar. And India believes that only the SSC can sort of manage that. That on the strategic front and the military front, India probably expects the SSC to have some control over the border, which I feel is the most counterintuitive and counterproductive aspect of India's expectations from SSC, because I don't think the SSC is in control of more than 10 to 15% of the border, at the India-Myanmar border at the moment. But as I said, these are some of the notional pivots of India's relationship with the SSC, which keeps up this relationship. And that's why you see this kind of engagement that you are seeing right now. What is also interesting, I will come back to this point on China, because it's interesting. I would say these meetings that have happened are not a coincidence, that they're happening right now. What we have also seen in the last 1.5 months is also China making somewhat of a political and strategic shift in favor of the SSC in Myanmar, kind of trying to mollycoddle the SSC and bring it closer to itself and give it more legitimacy than it was willing to give it so far. When China, at a time when China is doing that, I think there's a certain level of anxiety in Delhi about that. So India would want to follow in lockstep and also equally build up its leverage with the SSC so that the SSC doesn't move too close to China for its comfort.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I think we'll come back to China in a moment. But for now, the other side of the dual track coin, while there has been this continued bilateral engagement, you alluded to the recent engagements that the Ministry of External Affairs has had with some of the resistance actors, which I believe are the first such meetings since the coup. What do you make of these meetings, and how do you expect India's relationship with the resistance actors to change moving forward, particularly as they exert greater control over the borders?
Yeah, I think the meetings are, as I said, after 10/27, there's a realization that, the conflict landscape in Western Myanmar, particularly, which is relevant to Indian interests, has changed. And this map, territorial map of control, really shows why India would want to engage with NDSSC actors, which is that, large parts of the border region, including in Zagaing, almost most of Chin state and most of northern Rakhine at least are not in control of the SSC. Of course, this map is an inexhaustive one because, there are some centers which the SSC within these dotted lines are still in control of. For example, some of the urban centers in Chin state, for example, Hakka, Thantlang, etc. Like, I think this, I will probably show this map. Yeah, this probably gives a more detailed sort of map of territorial control. But I would say it is this map that would be sitting on the table of an Indian policy planner or security planner at the moment to see that what can be done. And the logical answer to that is that we've got to talk to these guys who are in control of the border, and not in non-sporadic control of the border areas, but sustained, effective control of the border areas, in a sense that the SSC has almost given up in reclaiming some of these areas. What is more important is that these are areas through which two of India's flagship projects, projects with Myanmar, cross-border projects in Myanmar cross. And the first one is the Kaladan Multimodal Transit and Transport Project. And this is a brilliant map that the print.in had created. And as you can see, this is the map of the Kaladan project, which is like a multimodal sea, water plus land, circular west to east corridor mostly to carry goods. As you can see, Sitwe Port is one of the main nodal points, and from Sitwe Port, the road travels first by river, by the Kaladan River, and then by overland route northward into northeast India. And most of these areas, and this is an overlap of the territorial control map of Western Myanmar with the project map of Kaladan project, and the other big project, which is barely complete or barely even began construction of, which is the India-Myanmar-Thailand Trilateral Highway Project. And in the inset, you can see the full map of the IMT highway, which enters Myanmar at the More Tamu crossing point, crosses across Myanmar, cuts through Mandalay, Naypyidaw, Yangon, and then ultimately branches off into Thailand via Mae Sot. But barely 10 to 20% of this is complete. But the key point here is that the bulk of the project routes, at least in Kaladan's case, and also the IMT highway, the entry point of the IMT highway, crosses through territory that's not under SSC control. And that's why I think India has been compelled to sort of talk to them. But what's interesting about the recent engagement is firstly, the recent engagement was reported to, the initial reports indicated that the Indian government would be hosting them in a seminar, the anti-SSC EAOs, in a seminar on constitutionalism and federalism at the Indian Council of World Affairs, which is a think tank under the Indian Ministry of External Affairs. But ultimately something else happened, which is that SSC-led delegation, which was actually led by the SSC Minister for Border Affairs, participated in that seminar on constitution and federalism. But it is understood that other meetings with the anti-SSC EOs happened behind back doors in smaller setups. And these would be the discussion, that how would India work with these groups to secure, firstly, the security of the border, the sanctity of the border, which is largely unfenced. And secondly, how would India manage to resume construction of these projects, despite them not being under SSC control? The last stretch of the road, which enters Mizoram, the Kaladan road, is still under construction, and India would need the cooperation of the Arakan army to resume construction of those roads. But what's important to also note is that the give and take. What would these groups expect from India in return, right? So I think these groups would expect India to provide also strategic and political support to these groups in some way. I don't know what that looks like. It could look like humanitarian aid, probably, which is given under the cover, or it could look like India looking away when many of these groups set up some of their strategic bases along the border. I don't know what that looks like, but these are rational speculations based on past evidence. So, but it's also worth asking what India would tell these groups to do. Whether India would tell them that you've got to participate in the election that's coming up, that you've got to sign some kind of a ceasefire agreement with the SSC, like China has been doing the northern groups, or would India avoid doing that? So these are some of the moot questions that arise when we talk about negotiations between Delhi and these EOs in Western Myanmar.
Great. Thanks very much for that. I see questions starting to pop in, and we'll get to those in a moment. But I want to, before we go to audience Q&A, just dive a little bit deeper on China. We, as you alluded to, have seen a major shift in China's approach to Myanmar over the past few months, with Beijing offering significant support to the SAC, including vis-a-vis its plans for the elections next year, while imposing almost unprecedented pressure on particularly groups along the China-Myanmar border, the MNDAA and the TNLA, but also on others as well. How do you see India responding to these shifts in China's approach? And do you anticipate, sort of a reactive approach to China, or more of a proactive approach from India's side to get ahead of the way that China might be approaching Myanmar?
Right. That's an interesting question. I think, in my view, India's policy towards Myanmar swings between being reactive and proactive. I would personally see it as more of a reactive policy. Many watchers and researchers might disagree with that. But in my view, I think what India has tried to do, arguably failingly, is sort of kind of follow in Chinese locksteps to do what China does. Which is trying to maintain some kind of a strategic and economic presence in Myanmar while also building a relationship with both sides. But but India doesn't have kind of the wherewithal, capacity, diplomatic capacity, or I would also say the material resources to build the kind of strategic depth with both sides that China has been able to build. So in this broader context, it is in this broader context that we have to see how India would react to this recent, this recent outreach by China. And a rational estimation is that, as I said, Chinese closeness to the SAC would cause a fair degree of anxiety in Delhi, which is that, here's China kind of doing everything in its capacity to woo the SAC. And also in the process, digging its heels deeper into Myanmar, and building this leverage with both sides in a way that it never has. And you could argue that today China is influential in Myanmar in a way that it hasn't been in a long time. That, as I said, would ring alarm bells in New Delhi. And it is, as I said earlier, it is precisely because of this probably that we see this flurry of meetings between the Indian ambassador and the top SAC leadership, and also this military-to-military collaboration. It's not just the visit of the naval officers to Naypyidaw, Indian naval officers to Myanmar, but last month the Indian Army also hosted a delegation from the National Defense College in Naypyidaw, in the National Defense College in New Delhi, for a training program. So you see this resumption of high-level military-to-military and political engagement, which is probably to match the Chinese influence. And in fact, India also, day before yesterday, inaugurated a set of projects, India-funded projects, under what is known as the Border Area Development Projects and the Rakhine State Development Projects in Myanmar. Again, this is to kind of match, I would say, Chinese economic ingress or economic outreach to Myanmar, likely under the BRI framework. And of course, this entire idea of building an economic corridor, this India-Myanmar Thailand trilateral highway, is also to balance China's BRI projects, be it the CMEC or the Museum Mandalay Railway project or the oil and gas pipeline. So you see this kind of mirror image happening. But once again, the kind of relationship that the Chinese have been able to build with the northern EAOs, I don't think India has been able to do that so far with the western EAOs.
Thank you. I have a lot more questions that I would like to ask, but I want to be respectful of all of the others who have joined us on the call today and the webinar. And so why don't we shift over to audience Q&A, and already have a handful of questions in there, but certainly would be interested in others, and especially questions on issues that we may not have tackled yet, like the situation in Rakhine, India's approach to refugees, Bangladesh-India relations and how that impacts the situation, as well as the potential impact of the US elections. But first, maybe I'll piggyback on that last question on China with a question from Yin Ai from Voice of America. What are the broader geopolitical implications of India's policy towards Myanmar, especially considering China's influence in the region? And Yin Ai also asks, are there concerns about China's influence driving this shift in India's approach?
Yes, I think India's engagement in Myanmar is crucial because as broadly speaking, it helps the region from becoming, I would say, tilting too much towards one power, which in this case is China. A balanced presence is always a good thing in a regional geopolitical sense. But this does not mean this proposition does not mean that India should be working with the SAC. In this case, that is the only way India can countervail Chinese presence. In fact, I've argued in my writings that a great way to counterbalance Chinese presence, Chinese influence in Myanmar for India would be to leverage its own position as the largest federal democracy in the region to provide support and capacity building support and political support and solidarity to the pro-democracy movement in Myanmar. It would not be out of line of India's foreign policy. India has always, even in recent times, talked about supporting democracy in Myanmar. And it seems like a bit of a contradiction when it works with a patently anti or counter-democratic or anti-democratic force like the SAC. So unlike China, who's not able to offer that kind of federal democratic support to Myanmar, I think India really is in a unique position to do that. And trust me, I think Myanmar's political class since the 1980s has really looked up to India as a model of not just democracy, but a federal democracy. So I think that is a very good counterbalancing pivot for India in that sense. So I think this is the kind of thinking that India needs to kind of adopt, in my view. It would need some diplomatic sort of audacity and imagination, but I think it can be done.
Thank you. Another question related to this. Do India and China have a shared interest in the SAC staying in power? And does this outweigh the competition in dueling projects in Myanmar and perhaps particularly in Western Myanmar?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because generally I would argue that Indian and Chinese interests overlap on several areas as far as Myanmar is concerned. Both of them, the baseline is both of them want a degree of stability in Myanmar. And the coup was, no matter what happened after that, no matter how either of them behaved after that, the coup was not good for either of them. It completely derailed the kind of momentum that both New Delhi and Beijing had built with the Aung San Suu Kyi government. China had successfully sort of sold the BRI project to Myanmar under the Suu Kyi government, and India had also built a very good warm working relationship with the Aung San Suu Kyi government, while also maintaining a very, very strong engagement with the Myanmar military. And I think the coup kind of disbalanced all of that, just threw it off the track. And both of them would want the war to stop, for some degree of stability to return to Myanmar. But for some reason, both tend to believe that it is only by empowering or building capacity directly with the SAC that they can bring back stability. Forgetting that, a basic point that I don't think the basic point that the SAC is not a force for stability. In fact, the kind of instability that we are seeing is purely the SAC is doing, in my view. And it's the SAC that can stop this. And I think that goes back to also a very fundamental point, which is unfortunately common between both Delhi and Beijing, which is this kind of misreading or under-reading of the revolutionary movement that we are seeing in Myanmar. This tendency to think that what's happening today has happened in the past, and there will be a course correction, which is that the military is facing a resistance from all fronts, yes, but ultimately the military will prevail, like it has in the past. But I argue that the situation, and many have argued that the situation is not what we have seen in the 80s, 90s, or 2000s. It's very different today. There's a whole generation of new activists. The war that we are seeing is a very different kind. And the SAC, the military, has not faced this kind of coordinated armed offensive or armed resistance that that it's facing today ever. So I think looking back to history in this case from the point of view from the vantage points of Delhi and Beijing doesn't help in that sense. But both of them do have a shared interest as far as stability in Myanmar is concerned.
Thank you. One more question on India and China, and this is from Stimson's own Robert Manning. India's dual track seems similar to China, contacts with both sides, working with the junta, but seems to stop short of any effort at a power broker role, which China seems to have reserved for itself. Is that an accurate assessment? And maybe I would add on to that. Could India play a power broker role even if it wanted to?
Interesting question, and reflects what I have said, right? Both of them would want to sort of mediate, but China seems to have greater ability and material resources, and a kind of legacy relationship with the EAOs to be able to do that. The other issue here is that I don't think India really has. We could say that India would like to be a power broker, but I don't think India has the willingness to seriously mediate in Myanmar. At least in a broad sense. Things might have shifted a bit after Operation 1027, but I don't think India has that kind of diplomatic bandwidth to play the role of a power broker, which is some people have written about this, and I have also written about this in my past article, which is that India spoke about mediating the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, right? But here's a conflict which is right next door. I think India should focus on that. If India wants to play the role of a constructive power broker, it's a good thing. I think it needs a kind of shrugging this kind of diplomatic foreign policy orthodoxy or conservatism that's very hardwired into the Indian foreign policy thinking, and doing something that India has never done before, probably, but India needs to do for its own good. But when I say power broker role, I think it should start small, which is from, as I said, from Western Myanmar. And it's not just, brokering peace between, the EAOs or the PDFs and the SAC. It's also probably playing the role of a force for good or a constructive mediator between some of the warring sides within these ethnic peripheries. For example, the different, the Chin groups, the Chin Brotherhood and the Chinland Council. And I think there's appetite from both these groups for India to come in and kind of create this united Chin front. But I think one word that describes India's policy towards this very well is risk averse. I don't think India wants to take any risks by stepping into Myanmar and trying to do something that it hasn't done, which is broker peace. So it does have an idea of brokering peace, but a very, very orthodox idea of brokering peace, where it sees both parties as kind of two sides squabbling within each other who need to sit down and talk to each other. But I think India needs to seriously think about the very, very sophisticated ideas behind the current revolution in Myanmar, including the new constitutional federal democratic union, and work towards that.
Thanks for that. Maybe shifting, we have a couple of questions related to domestic politics in India and how that impacts dynamics with Myanmar. So first from Kiel Dietz in the Office of the UN Special Rapporteur on Myanmar. Is there a meaningful split between the BJP and other Indian political parties on Myanmar policy? As in, is Myanmar a political issue or something that is dealt with lower levels of priority?
That's a great question. I think there is bipartisan consensus on India's policy on Myanmar as it is today. Because let's not forget that this idea of pragmatic idea of working with whoever is in power in Naypyidaw, it could be a military regime, a brutal military regime, developed during the time of the Congress government in India. UK's policy was launched by Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao, who was a Congress Prime Minister. The 2000s, when Than Shwe was welcomed in Delhi, and India, India signed a series of economic agreements with the Than Shwe regime, and also sold heavy military hardware to the Than Shwe regime, including more RPGs, assault rifles, even a battle tank. All happened under Congress governments. So this idea, this policy of working in Myanmar with the military regime in Myanmar predates the BJP. So at the moment, I don't think there is any meaningful split in my view. In fact, and as Kiel has asked, also asked very rightly, which is I don't think it's a political issue as such. It doesn't feature in parliament. Myanmar doesn't feature in parliamentary debates in India, except on one issue, which is Manipur. The conflict that's happening in Manipur at the moment. Myanmar has been featuring in mainstream political debates in India from the vantage point of Manipur, which is a highly politicized, ethnicized, and securitized vantage point. It's a very, very secure, highly securitized perspective, where Myanmar is seen as kind of a source for violence, cross-border violence, or cross-border contraband that's fueling the violence in Manipur. So Myanmar is being framed in a very adverse manner, I would say, by certain political parties. But as far as the situation inside Myanmar is concerned, I don't think there's much visibility in mainstream Indian politics, unfortunately.
That's a good segue to a couple of other questions. One from Michael Martin, a adjunct fellow at CSIS. Could you provide a briefing on the role of the local governments in the states of Mizoram and Manipur in relations with the SAC, DAA, the Chinland Council, and the Chin Brotherhood Alliance? What role does local ethnic ties play in the attitudes and policies of local government officials? How do these local officials navigate relations with the central government in Delhi? And then maybe, if not to overload you, one more that's related to this is how has the recent interethnic turmoil in Northeast India played into New Delhi's policy towards Myanmar? And that last question was from Keel Dietz again.
I think, if you see this map, which kind of shows the spectrum of support that refugees from Myanmar receive in various border states of Northeast India, it's clear that, as many of you must already know, it's the Mizoram government that has come out with the strongest sort of extension of support to refugees from Myanmar, especially Chin refugees from Myanmar, because the Chin and the Mizo belong to the same ethnic group, the broader super ethnic group, which is a Zo ethnic group, right? So more than 33,000, and unofficial figures are 40,000 and more, refugees from Myanmar are currently in Mizoram, and the Mizoram state government and the civil society, which is very, very powerful, has been supporting them very strongly. Earlier this year, there was a change in government in Mizoram, but the new government has also come out and continued the policy of support for the humanitarian support for the refugees from Myanmar. But right up north in the neighboring state of Manipur, it's completely opposite, which is the state government of Manipur, which is a BJP-ruled state government, BJP-ruled Meitei ethnic-dominated state government, is extremely hostile towards refugees from Myanmar. Refugees from Myanmar in Manipur are often framed as, drug traffickers, arms smugglers, infiltrators, invaders, etc. And there's this fear that refugees from Myanmar are adding to some kind of a demographic shift in Manipur, away from the Meitei population towards the Kuki-Zo population. So the current ethnic conflict in Manipur, which is between the dominant majority, Meitei majority, and the Kuki-Zo tribal groups, has been framed also, as I said, Myanmar has also been dragged into that, and the refugees have also been dragged into that. And as you must know, many of the refugees have also been detained by the Manipur state government in Manipur, and some of them have also been deported back to Myanmar, and very, very worryingly, they have been handed over to the SAC while deporting them, pushing them back across the border. And there are some advocacy groups in India, very courageous advocacy groups in India who are continuously fighting, advocating for the release of these detained refugees, and in Manipur. I would also add that about 24 Chin refugees are also detained in a detention center in Assam, which is the largest state in Northeast India. So in Assam and Manipur, largely they continue to face adverse situation. In Nagaland, it's more or less neutral. The state government hasn't proactively supported the refugees, but it also hasn't pushed them out. So the refugees are relying on more sort of local village level volunteer groups and civil society groups for support. But as I said, Mizoram has the most elaborate and extensive refugee support system. I don't know if you can see. Okay, that slide isn't here, but as I said, it's a refugee support ecosystem that involves multiple actors: the state government, the civil society, cross-border community-based organizations, faith-based organizations, and local refugee-led organizations also. What's interesting is that Delhi hasn't really stopped Mizoram from hosting the refugees. Initially, it tried to stop Mizoram from doing so, but the Mizo government very, very strongly came out in support and actively defied the Prime Minister Narendra Modi government's order to not support the refugees. And Mizoram is also politically important, more or less politically important for Delhi. The BJP would like to keep the ruling party in Mizoram right now, which is ZPM, Zoram People's Movement, in its good books. So it wouldn't want to sort of alienate or push the buttons too much on this issue. Secondly, the Mizo government is a very, very important interlocutor, subnational interlocutor between Delhi and the Chin groups and also the Arakan groups. If you remember the photo that I showed, that was a Mizo member of parliament who went and met the Arakan army. So the Mizo political elite and the civil society elite have very unique relationships with the Chin political elite and the Chin armed group leaders, also the Arakan armed group leaders. So they can be very important go-betweens if Delhi wants to talk to these groups, right? So this is a very complex sort of, you could say, federal dynamic or dialectic between Mizoram and Delhi that's shaping this relationship.
Thank you. Next from Kirsten Canby, does India have interest in Myanmar's natural resources, oil, gas, mining, timber? If so, how does it address Indian engagement with the SAC or ethnic armed groups? What is engagement of Indian individuals and businesses in this area?
Yeah, I mean, I think the bottom line here is that all aspiring powers have interest in natural resources, in its neighborhood, and of course within its own territory. So yes, the short answer is yes, it does, and it's not an abstract answer. It's backed by evidence, which is that India does have oil and gas assets in the Shui gas field off the coast of Rakhine. It does the ONGC, which is a public sector undertaking in Delhi, in India, which is the Indian Oil and Natural Gas Corporation, as a foreign arm which operates in Myanmar, which has been operating Myanmar for a long time. It has been drilling gas from the Shui gas, so it has extraction rights in 2 blocks within the Shui gas oil fields. But weirdly, it's a very bizarre arrangement where the extraction is done by ONGC, but the end product is actually goes to China, not India. So that's what's happening. But India, there were also, before the coup, there were also plans to build a pipeline from Assam. Assam has many oil refineries, so build a pipeline from Assam to Myanmar, and also open retail petroleum outlets of Indian petroleum companies in Myanmar. So those plans have been there for a long time. But there is one, big hurdle, which is that the terrain of Western Myanmar is very, very hostile. It's it's not easy to navigate that terrain. It's deeply forested. It's uneven. So even if there's natural resources, including rare earths, I think it would need a lot of material resources and investments in order to extract them. And China has been able to do that along the northern frontier, be it along in northern Shan state or even in northern Kachin, including what used to be the Kachin Special Region 1, which is now abolished, where rare earth mining happens. But that kind of natural resources extraction hasn't happened so far along the India-Myanmar borderland. But yes, India does have interest in this sort of stuff.
Thank you. We've got about 10 more minutes, so if you haven't gotten your questions in, we'll have time for a few more. So please get those in now. We do have a few other questions now about the situation in Rakhine and India's approach to Rakhine. First from Andrew Van Genderen. I apologize if I mispronounced your name there. A student at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. My question about the Arakan Army and whether New Delhi is coming to see it in its interest to support Arakan independence in the form of either a highly autonomous statelet or even perhaps a new independent ethno-state. Given the weakness of the SAC, would such an approach serve India's Caledon multimodal transport ambitions and help better protect the Northeast region?
It's an interesting question. I would say the short answer is I don't think India is given it such a deep thought yet, that whether in the near future it would be willing to come out and support an independent Arakan state or a sovereign Arakan state. But what's worth talking about here is that the Indian state has a natural aversion towards any armed movement that borders along separatism. That is also because of India's own experience in the northeast region. So if India ends up supporting an autonomous ethnic enclave in its neighborhood, it would seem to be setting a similar precedent, for its own armed movements within its own territory, and would set certain kind of political strategy, as I said, precedent for the future. So I don't think India would be doing that. And of course, in this context, India would also think about the SAC or any future federal Burmese government's sentiments about this. So if supporting an independent Arakan state would mean completely alienating the military regime, then I think that's completely out of question for India. India wouldn't do that. But it's an interesting question because for India, the Kaladan project is extremely important. So if the Arakan army says that you've got to extend some support to an independent Arakan state if you want to protect your Kaladan multimodal project, then it would be interesting to see what happens then. At a broader level, I don't think India would lend explicit support, but it is possible that India does so at a subterranean level.
Thanks. A related question that broadens out some of those dynamics from Sarah Godek at Stimson. As the AA continues to expand its foothold, how will India's expectations for both the EAOs and the SAC change? And maybe I would broaden that out specifically to how its expectations of the AA and perhaps the Chin groups will evolve.
Yeah. I think it's interesting here. I think probably, if I just in case I forget, I want to emphasize on the fact that the friction that's developing, or that has already emerged very much between the AA and the Chin National Front or the Chinland Council is something that makes India uncomfortable. And in addition to the friction between the Chinland Brotherhood and the Chinland Council. Ideally, it works in India's favor if these EAOs work with each other and collaborate with each other, so that India is able to talk to one side without annoying the other side or without alienating the other side. So right now, I think a lot of the energy is focused on ensuring that there is some coordination between all of these groups in Western Myanmar, so that India knows whom to talk to. Right? And this has always been a problem, that probably there has been a willingness to talk to some of these groups, but India has always been confused as to, okay, whom do we talk to? If we talk to the AA, the CNF doesn't talk to us. If we talk to the CNF, the AA would probably be annoyed. And if we just talk to the CNF and AA, the NUG might think that it's out of the loop, right? So there's this kind of dilemma from India's point of view of too many actors, right, in Myanmar. But I have also argued that India needs to, really seriously understand the relationships between all of these actors if it wants to resolve this fix. But AA is probably the most important ethnic armed organization at the moment in Myanmar, in my view. That's also because AA has the most strategic legroom as far as all the EAOs in Myanmar go, because it's not exactly proximate to China. So China is not able to extend the kind of leverage or exercise the kind of leverage that it does with the TNLA, with the MNDA, or even the KIA, for that matter. So AA has a kind of latitude to do what it wants, right? And that makes AA extremely important for India. So India has this opportunity to develop a very, very special, unique relationship with the AA and the CNF and the other Chin groups in order to build the kind of broader strategic depth that China has been able to do in Myanmar through the northern groups. And I think India would like to do that at the moment. Yeah, that's a short answer. Not so short answer.
Thank you. Time for a couple more questions. One that's going back a little bit to domestic politics in India. What is the relationship between India's ruling party? This is from Tin Shai Nong. What is the current status of the relationship between India's ruling party and Myanmar's nationalist and religious groups, which play a significant role in the SAC government's psychological warfare against civilians?
Yes, that's a very interesting question, and it's a question that needs much more research than has been done so far. There is a great deal and great degree of ideological convergence and congruence between the Hindu nationalist political movement in India, of which the BJP is the most clear manifestation or the most institutionalized manifestation, and the Bamar Buddhist nationalist or ultra-nationalist factions in Myanmar. We routinely see references to the Rohingya genocide amongst Hindu nationalists in the Hindu nationalist cyber ecosystem in India. There have been times when many Hindu nationalist figures have come out in public and reference the Rohingya genocide as an ideal model to follow in India's case. So that kind of terrifying congruence we've seen. But at the same time, I don't think that has that kind of ecosystem level or popular level, discursive level congruence has amounted to kind of a political congruence in that sense between the BJP and let's say the USDP or the Buddhist Sangha in Myanmar. But it is true that Myanmar till today has a powerful, wealthy and politically influential Hindu elite, mostly a business elite. And you would see that the Indian embassy in Yangon does a lot of outreach to this powerful Hindu elite. And many of these elites have very, very good relationships with the Bamar nationalists, with the former military officers, with the USDP government folks, and even people from the Than Shwe regime, and also with the Buddhist monks, right? So there is a level of interaction, exchange that's happening, and I would argue that is partly driving the warmth that we see between Delhi and the SAC at the moment. These are the kind of cultural, religious, and social lobbies, diasporic lobbies that need to be looked at more in order to understand why is there this resurgence of warmth between or amicability between Delhi and the SAC. But yeah, it's an interesting question for that simple reason.
All right, maybe one last question again from Kiel Dietz in the UN Special Rapporteur's Office. Forward-looking, could you talk briefly about the Indian government's views towards possible elections next year?
Yes. Again, interesting question. There's been a lot of speculation around this, and we don't yet know what the formal position is going to be. But my rational estimation would be India would extend support. I mean, I'm talking in a formal sense, in an official documented sense, would extend support to any kind of election that happens in Myanmar. And let's also not forget that I think earlier this year, a senior SSC official visited India to understand India's Aadhaar biometric identity system and also the electronic voting machine system. So there has been a exchange of technical information and technical know-how from India to Myanmar. So there's already been that kind of support. Whether that amounts to Delhi coming out openly and expressing support for the election remains to be seen. But if it is done, my assumption is that it would be done framed in a careful manner, which is that something like India is happy to see the resumption of the democratic process in Myanmar and hopes that it reaches its logical conclusion, right? Because it also rationalizes India's formal relationship with the SSC. So I think given that, India would extend support to the election if it happens next year.
Well, on that note, thank you very much to everyone who has joined online, and my special thanks to Angshuman for what was really a tour de force of India-Myanmar relations, a look at the relationships with both the military side and resistance actors, local politics and dynamics within the Northeast, and looking ahead to issues like the elections, which are likely to arise in the coming months in Myanmar. Greatly appreciate everyone for joining, and look forward to seeing how things evolve in the India-Myanmar relationship in the coming months. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Stimson. And thanks, everyone, for asking those questions. Really provoked a lot of thought in my own